Good afternoon. My name is Subodh Chandra, and I'm a local Cleveland attorney and a proud graduate of the Yale Law School. In having the privilege today to introduce the Dean of the Yale Law School, Harold Hongju Koh, I could go on and on about how he's a graduate of Harvard and was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford and also a graduate of the Harvard Law School. I could go on and on about how he clerked for the D.C. Circuit for Justice Harry Blackmun, how he worked for the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice, how he worked in the private sector at a distinguished law firm. I could tell you even more about his career as a distinguished legal scholar, the author of 70 articles and books on international law topics, the Constitution, international trade. I could tell you about his distinguished service as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, advising Secretary Albright during the Clinton administration on human rights issues throughout the globe and religious freedom. I could tell you about what a marvelous dean he's been at Yale Law School. And yes, I could go on and on and on, but all I would be doing is conveying the resume and not the resolute nature of the human being. So I'm going to take just a moment of personal privilege to tell you about the Dean Harold Koh that I know. And I know him through the eyes of a then 22, 23-year-old trying to decide where to go to law school. And I met this incredibly vibrant young legal scholar at Yale who cornered me in a room and sought to persuade me why I should not go to his alma mater, Harvard Law School, but instead should go to Yale. But he was listening at the same time that he was talking and hearing about my interest in public service and hearing about the things that were important to me. And he said that this would be a better place for somebody with my interest in public service and public policy. And so I went home to Oklahoma and tried to explain to immigrant parents why the school they'd heard of was not the one I was going to attend, that instead this young Asian American superstar legal scholar had persuaded me to attend Yale. And I wrote the dean a letter letting him know I appreciated his words, that they'd been decisive, that I'd had some difficulty with my parents, but had made the decision nevertheless. And even though my parents viewed it as a fundamentally irrational decision, I was going to be coming to Yale Law School that fall. And I got the most wonderful, unexpected letter back from Harold Koh, this young legal scholar, that said, "I'm so glad you made this decision, and I promise to do everything in my power to make it a decision you never regret." And I thought those were incredibly sweet and kind words, and I still have that letter to this day. Cut to about a year later, I've finished my first year at Yale. I had been this person who used to babysit all the faculty kids, and I was at the time babysitting Harold Koh's children. And the dean drove me back one evening to my apartment at the end of a babysitting session, and he was asking me all kinds of questions about how things had gone this year and what did I think, and I told him about the ups and the downs and the things that were magnificent and the things that were disappointments. And as we pulled in front of my apartment, Harold Koh turns to me, this person that we all admired as students as he organized students to take on the federal government on its Haitian repatriation policy and brought them to pull together legal briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court. This person that I really worshiped and adored, he turns to me and he says, "Good, I wanted to know because I know I have a promise out to you." Well, I think that tells you a little bit more that you need to know about Harold Koh and his commitment. And it's emblematic of his commitment to everything else, the rule of law, the Constitution, and human rights throughout the globe. We're going to hear about that today. Please join me in welcoming the Dean of the Yale Law School, Harold Hongju Koh.
Thank you, Subodh. There are many satisfactions in academic life, but none more than to have a student like Subodh, who you see as a young student, see him become an outstanding public servant, a wonderful lawyer, but who maintains all of the joy and humor of his student days, and with a wonderful family now, and thriving here in the city of Cleveland. I'm sorry. And I was thinking of Cincinnati because my good friend Ken Moore is here. His wife, Karen Nelson Moore, was my predecessor clerking for Justice Blackmun. Now, of course, sits on the Sixth Circuit, and while living here in Cleveland, is in Cincinnati today. And I've heard from them all about the City Club and what a great forum of free speech it is. And I'm delighted to see friends from the Yale Law School Alumni Association. This is a serious time, as everyone knows, just looking at today's newspapers. And so I hope you don't mind if I address a serious subject, which is repairing our human rights reputation. I want to say up front that what you're going to hear is not a partisan message. During my career, I worked both in and out of the government, as Subodh told you. I worked in the Justice Department and the State Department. I worked both for Republican and Democratic administrations, and maybe as important, I sued both Republican and Democratic administrations for human rights violations. And from those perspectives, I have come to think that the task of repairing our human rights reputation is one of the most serious problems we face today. Since all of us have been alive, our country, the U.S., has been the world's acknowledged human rights leader. That's why my parents came here, probably yours as well. Since World War II, we were universally regarded as a nation that values human rights and the rule of law, that speaks out against injustice and dictatorship, that tries to practice what we preach. Of course, we were never perfect, but we were usually thought to be sincere. And when I was a diplomat for the U.S. government, I was always struck by how seriously other countries would listen to what Americans had to say. They listened because we were powerful, sure, but they thought we were powerful because they thought we were principled. And it was our commitment to principles of human rights and the rule of law that were seen as a major source of our moral authority, which was indeed a major source of our power. But in the last few years, sadly, much of this has changed. I travel a lot, some of you do too. If you've traveled abroad, you can't help but notice the steady decline of our global human rights reputation. In the last 7 years, we've gone from being viewed as the major supporter of the international human rights system to one of its major targets. Our obsessive focus on the war on terror has taken an extraordinary toll on our human rights policy. 7 years of defining our human rights policy through the lens of terror has clouded our human rights reputation. It's given cover to abuses committed by our allies in that war, and it's blunted our ability to criticize and deter violators elsewhere. After September 11th, we were properly viewed as victims of a brutal attack by the whole world. But we have responded with a series of unnecessary and self-inflicted wounds which have diminished our standing. And you know the list as well as I do. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, torture, cruel treatment for detainees, military commissions, warrantless government wiretapping, our attack on the UN and its human rights bodies, including the International Criminal Court, and the denial of habeas corpus for detainees on Guantanamo, which thankfully was struck down this past summer, but by the smallest margin of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, whatever you think of these policies, make no mistake that they have had a devastating impact on our human rights reputation. A recent survey showed that in 1998, the vast majority of our European allies thought we were doing a good job in human rights leadership. Today, a vast majority feels the opposite. Most Europeans think our Guantanamo policy is illegal. In a global attitude survey, favorable opinions of our country had fallen in all of our 15 closest allies, even though those polled shared our view of the greatest dangers in the world. And in those countries, amazingly, our presence in Iraq is cited as a danger to world peace at least as often as the threat of Iran. And when I was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in 1999, I told the UN body, the United States is unalterably committed to a world without torture. It wasn't a casual statement.